Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride. I'm joined this evening by two of the leaders of the independence movement. Firstly, by the co-convener of the Scottish Independence Convention, Maggie Chapman. Maggie, how are you doing this evening?
Hello there, Kenny. Very well, thanks. And you?
I'm not bad at all. It's good to hear you're well.
Good.
And on the other side of me, we have the Deputy Leader of the SNP, Keith Brown. How are you doing, Keith?
I'm fine, very good. How are yourself?
I'm not bad. So we start as before we get to it, we are going to be talking tonight about the roadmap to independence and where the whole movement stands at the moment. But first we have the news headlines, and we start as we always do with our coronavirus statistics update. And as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 519,762 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 499,655 were confirmed negative, 20,107 were positive. There were 51 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, but again, another day with no new reported deaths. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will necessarily get tested. Although, as we always do, we urge you, if you are showing symptoms of any kind, please do book a test as quickly as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 255 people in hospital last night, 3 of whom were in intensive care. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection remains at 2,494. This number only includes those who have died in hospital, having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show that 41,486 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 9 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. 3 core missions for the new Scottish National Investment Bank have been laid before Parliament for consultation. The core missions focus the bank's activities on addressing key challenges and creating inclusive long-term economic growth. This will enable the bank to play a significant role in supporting Scotland's economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. The proposed missions aim to support the just transition to net zero emissions by 2045, creating opportunity and reducing inequality, harnessing innovation in response to demographic challenges. The bank is on schedule to launch by the end of this year, and the Scottish Government has committed to capitalising it with £2 billion over 10 years. SNP MP and former MEP Alan Smith has warned the UK faces a Tory Brexit disaster and that Scotland's best deal is with Europe, as MPs prepare to return to Parliament next week. Last month, Tory and Labour MPs joined forces to block cross-party calls for an extension to the transition period, a move that will see Scotland and the UK crash out of the EU with a bad deal in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic and the associated economic crisis. SNP MPs backed the motion, Scottish Tory MPs voted against it, and Labour MPs abstained. Donald Trump last night formally accepted the Republican Party's nomination for November's presidential election on the 4th night of the party's virtual convention. Trump warned of a move to the far left as if his opponent, career centrist Joe Biden, were elected to replace him, and claimed only he could solve the dual crises of the coronavirus pandemic and ongoing protests over racial inequality in the US. Meanwhile, as protests continue in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a teenage vigilante has been charged with shooting 3 people protesting Sunday's police shooting of black man Jacob Blake, black activists have converged on Washington, D.C. to mark the 57th anniversary of Martin Luther King's March on Washington when he made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. A Swedish photojournalist has been deported from Belarus amid a crackdown on local and foreign media and ahead of further mass protests planned for the weekend against the president Alexander Lukashenko. Paul Hansen was given 24 hours to leave the country and banned from Belarus for 5 years. He was one of 50 reporters rounded up by riot police yesterday and taken into custody, ostensibly so their documents could be checked. Most of the journalists were later released, but 4 Minsk-based correspondents were detained overnight and appeared in court today, charged with organising illegal protests. Broadcasting Scotland, of course, stands in solidarity with all journalists throughout the world. Japan's Shinzo Abe announced today that he was resigning because of poor health, ending his tenure as the country's longest-serving prime minister, in which he sought to revive an economy struck by deflation and pushed for a stronger military. His departure will trigger a leadership battle in his Liberal Democratic Party over the next few weeks. The winner will likely stick to Abe's reflationary Abenomics policies that had mixed results in resuscitating the world's third-largest economy. Abe has battled ulcerative colitis for years, and 2 recent hospital visits within a week had raised questions about whether he could stay on until his term ends in September next year. The culture and heritage sectors are to benefit from a £59 million funding package to protect jobs and help the industry weather the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. A new £15 million culture organisations and venues recovery fund will provide critical support to a range of businesses such as art galleries, studio facilities, comedy venues, large music venues, commercial theatres, orchestras, dance companies and nightclubs. It is intended to help reduce the threat of insolvency, protect jobs and create conditions for a more viable and sustainable future for the sector. And 70% of voters expressing an opinion have more confidence in the SNP Scottish Government to manage the economy compared with Westminster, according to a new poll. The panel-based poll conducted for Business for Scotland also found that 55% of voters expressing a preference believe that independence will be good for Scotland's economy. 68% of voters also agreed that Brexit will be bad for Scotland's economy. The poll also found that almost a third of Tory voters rejected the notion that Boris Johnson's Brexit will be good for the economy. And Keith, this really kind of starts us off where we were talking about there about the economy, about GERS. This, of course, has been GERSmas week. Lots of political and economic geeks have been very excited about that. But in terms of the independence debate, it's perhaps produced a bit more heat than light. What do you think we can learn from GERS that's of use to us in talking about Scotland's future?
Well, its relevance, to the extent that it has any, is really about the devolved situation just now. It tells us nothing about an independent Scotland. But I think we can see from the political discussion round about it is it's becoming less and less of a weapon being used by the Unionists. It's really a counsel of despair to say that Scotland is essentially economically depressed relative to other countries and it requires the UK government to bail it out. Now, most people know that not to be the case. Scotland has huge natural resources, huge human capital. There is no reason why we should be trailing behind Denmark and Ireland and so on. So I think people are less inclined to listen to the Unionists' use of GERS, which of course was, first of all, constructed by a unionist, Ian Lang, for political purposes. And it's very interesting that, as you've just said, around 70% of people think Scotland could manage its own affairs better in independent Scotland, and they trust the Scottish Government more than the UK Government. So I think it's some of the hyperbole we've seen from Unionists this time is becoming more and more panicky and overplayed. And people just intrinsically don't believe that Scotland is a country incapable of governing its own affairs properly and its economy. You mentioned the Scottish National Investment Bank, something Westminster would never have done for Scotland. So Scotland can take the right decisions for itself. And I think it's very important that that self-confidence is built upon by those of us supporting independence.
Now, obviously, Unionists have tried to use this as a stick to beat the Scottish Government with. But of course, it doesn't show the picture of what an independent Scotland would look like. There was talk last year of the SNP or perhaps the Scottish Government, I don't remember exactly which it was, producing a kind of parallel GERS that would show what an independent Scotland's economy might look like. Now, that hasn't happened this year. What is the situation with that? Is that something that is going to be done in future? Is that something we can look forward to next year? Or is that now off the table again?
Well, that's really for the Scottish Government to answer. But I think the Scottish Government, and of course the Scottish Government is SNP-led, has made the case for independence through its support for the Growth Commission as passed by the SNP conference. Attracted different points of view, but it was passed. largely or overwhelmingly by the SNP delegates with amendments. And I think that lays out what we think an independent Scotland should look like. So, one where we start off with sterling, we move forward to our own currency as soon as practically possible. And also, I think it's incumbent upon the SNP, which is partly doing through the Scottish, the Social Justice Commission that's been established, to lay out what an independent Scotland would look like in terms of social justice as well as the economy and finance. So I think it's very important that we draw a contrast between the built-in inequality the UK has had for decades now, also the economic mismanagement that shows them now over £2 trillion in debt compared to Norway, the same size as Scotland, with £1 trillion in its oil fund. So I think we have to hold out the prospect of something far better than the disaster capitalism that we get from the Tories in the UK. And also importantly, the economic decisions, like every other decision in independent Scotland, will be decisions taken by Scots for themselves. And you learn your lessons from your mistakes as well as your successes. But surely we could do better than the current situation we have from the UK.
Mm-hmm. And Maggie, if I could turn to you now. You're kind of a wee bit removed from the sort of daily cut and thrust of party politics now. What is it like for you seeing this debate over these GERS figures that, as we've said, really don't tell us an awful lot of useful information?
Yeah, thanks, Kenny. I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Keith has said. I think the whole use of the figures, the GERS figures, it seems to me that every year we have this discussion, and every year the unionists' argument is the same. And in some ways, this is their only argument, and we know that it doesn't stack up. Even if we take the numbers that the GERS that the figures give us, even if we take those figures at face value, what we know is that it's been the UK government that has got us into this mess over the last couple of decades. For much of the last 50 years, Scotland created a surplus. Scotland ran a surplus for much of the last 50 years. And to say that the answer now to a deficit that the Thatcher government started the trajectory of, that, you know, the Tory government in the 80s and 90s started the trajectory of by destroying British industry, by running unemployment levels to 3 million and more. You know, that's actually just a ludicrous and absurd suggestion. You know, the answer to a deficit, to have London continuing to run Scotland in a way that has resulted in exactly this position in the last 20 years is just a nonsense. And yet the unionists come back to this time and time again because it is their only argument for the union. You know, we know that the numbers in Scotland don't stack up in that way. We know that Scotland can definitely survive and thrive as an independent country, especially because it will be Scottish people making the decisions about what happens here. And we will make, as I think we've seen very recently, but we will make very different kinds of decisions around Scotland's future, around our economy. And importantly, we see the connections between economic well-being and other forms of well-being. Keith talked about the Social Justice Commission. It is, we cannot just see the economy as being the only thing that matters. And yet, you know, we see that is the way the UK government is treating us now. Individuals across the UK are consumers, they are workers, and that's pretty, and shoppers. That's pretty much it. You know, in terms of the response to the COVID crisis, we've not seen a holistic response from the UK government at all, in the same way as there's been a very, very clear position from the Scottish government, and I think from the Scottish Parliament as a whole, that, you know, it's not economy or health. That isn't the choice. Both have to work together. And then if we start thinking about the other things that we could have and we should have control over, like our environmental regulations, the wider cultural aspects of our lives, we know that we can make very different decisions as an independent country and be economically viable at the same time.
I asked Kate Forbes about this the other day. I wonder what you think of it, coming from that green perspective that you have, about the idea of perhaps adding a sort of triple bottom line dimension to things like GERS, where we could look at what our social deficit and what our carbon deficit looks like, just as much as we look at our fiscal deficit, such as it is. What do you think of that kind of idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always within the Greens, but within the wider independence movement, I think there's been a very, very strong push to look beyond things like GDP as measures of success. We need to be taking into account other aspects of lives, the things that actually make life livable and survivable for us as humans. So our wider non-human environment. You know, you talk about carbon deficit, but air quality, these kinds of things, well-being, individual well-being, community well-being, different measures of success. We know that the economic measures of success that we have been using for too long actually don't tell you anything about people's happiness, about people's well-being, about their ability to live and function in community. And the perpetuation of GDP as the mark of success means that ludicrous things are counted as good things. You know, a pile up, a traffic accident involving many vehicles on a motorway is a good thing for GDP. That's just nonsense. We shouldn't be using those kinds of measures as markers of a successful economy, never mind markers of a successful country. There are so many other aspects of our lives that we absolutely have to be taking into account. And I think, you know, there's excellent work being done on this. People like Catherine Trebek in the We All Alliance, looking beyond the economy as the only marker of success, looking beyond GDP, looking at well-being, looking at health, looking at culture, looking at combining everything that makes us human and thinking and taking all of those aspects and saying we need to understand how all of these work together if we are to understand what makes a successful country, because the economy isn't the only measure, and it's certainly not the only measure the way we currently measure it.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a little bit about the way that unionists have reacted to this, but the language coming from unionists, particularly in the last couple of weeks, has really changed, I think, or at least become more extreme. We've seen Douglas Ross, for example, the new Scottish Tory leader, talking about an unrelenting war on the SNP. Brian Beacom in the Scotsman this week talked about the coming indie war. I wonder, Keith, what do you make of this kind of increasingly violent rhetoric that we're hearing from certain corners of unionism?
Well, I think it's of a piece with what we've just been talking about, GERS. I mean, how shrill the unionists are about talking about GERS. I see one of the comments in the chat bar saying that the independence movement has to be much more blunt with it. Well, I'm not so sure that we have to do what they're doing or react to what they're doing in that way. I think it's better to do as Maggie has just done and as I would try to do, to lay out what an independent Scotland would look like, not spending £3.5 billion on defence when you only get £1.7 billion worth anyway, and much of that £3.5 billion goes on nuclear weapons that we don't want. I think we're better to lay out a positive option for this. And when the unionists talk about GERS, when they also talk in increasingly apocalyptic terms about the very idea of a referendum, it will never happen no matter how many times Scotland votes for it and so on, I think they're becoming more shrill and panicky, and we shouldn't mimic what they are doing. Now, it's always true to say, in politics, many parties have used metaphors of conflict to try and underline the point they're trying to make, but it does strike me how frequently and how luridly the unionists, in particular the Tories, use the language of war for these things. Was it Ruth Davidson said that after 2014 they should have stuck the boot into the Yes movement, things like that, and it seems to, I think, misread the public mood. And I think it was always very odd, but I think even especially at this time with what we're going through with the pandemic, to continually be talking about conflict and in war. And then, as Douglas Ross has done, try and talk in the same breath about how we have to build bridges and listen to people. You don't build bridges and listen to people if you're carrying a war against them. So if they want to continue doing that, I don't think it helps their case. I think it does help our case, but we shouldn't fall into this trap of doing likewise. I think the reason that we're now sitting 55% of the polls, and when I first started for the independence movement, we were at 12% in the polls. 55% in the polls is because we are bringing people across to us that are attracted by a positive message. And I think we should continue to do that and let the unionists go on with their war analogies and conflict and all the rest of it. That's down to them. I don't think it helps us if we do the same.
Mm. And as a long-time SNP member and an elected member as well, Jamie Blackett, who's the deputy leader of George Galloway's Alliance for Unity group, who are getting quite a lot of attention just now, despite not even being officially registered as a party yet. He described the SNP, he talked about the SNP's soulmates in Sinn Féin and referred to the SNP being the political wing of a movement that had this other wing while talking about politics in Northern Ireland. How does that affect you when you hear yourself being compared to Sinn Féin like that?
Yeah, I see the guy in question describes himself as a Falklands veteran. Well, if that was the case, and if he has experienced war and conflict to that extent, then he shouldn't be using language like this. But again, I would come back to the point that we in the broad independence movement, and including within that the SNP, if we get too preoccupied with these things, then we're on their ground in terms of the arguments that have to be deployed. I think it's nonsensical. The SNP has, throughout its time, been a peaceful movement. It's never embraced armed struggle. It's never been involved with that kind of politics. This guy, I don't really know him, but I assume he knows that. So this is done for effect. And I'm not sure the effect is as productive for the unionist side, whichever shade of it is, Tories or this new party, which has George Galloway in it. I'm not sure it has the effect that they want to have. But usually when politicians become very shrill and lurid in their language, it's because they know they're fighting a losing battle. So we should take some heart from this kind of insult and pejorative language, I think, but we shouldn't seek to copy it. I think it's really important. We are now talking to people in Scotland who are in the majority that want to see an independent Scotland. They're looking to us, and I mean all those in the independence movement, for a clue as to what an independent Scotland would look like. There should be no place in an independent Scotland for this kind of nonsense about armed struggle and portraying your opponents as in that way, and all this talk of war all the time. So try and be the kind of independent Scotland, or demonstrate the kind of independent Scotland that we want to see, and that's what will make sure that we keep pushing forward that support for independence.
Mm-hmm. Maggie, this week we've also, I don't know if you've been aware of it, I don't know how much time you spend on Twitter, but Andrew Neil, the BBC journalist, has been engaged in a furious argument with a number of people, including James Dornan and others, about GERS and about the prospects for independence. What do you make of that kind of that BBC impartiality?
Where do we start on media impartiality and media support? I think the important point in all of this is it's a strategic attempt to make the whole debate around independence toxic. You know, the military language, the references to armed struggle and that kind of thing. It's all about making the debate around independence toxic to drive people away from it. I think in many people's hope, well, in many unionists' hopes, to drive us all away from that and away from being able to galvanize support. I think, you know, the notion, going back to a couple of the points that you were discussing with Keith, the talk of you know, the SNP being the political wing of another movement. I'm tempted to say that the British government is the political wing of the British Army. You know, that kind of speak is Trumpian. It's terribly dystopian. It's there to make the debate horrible, and it's there to turn people off from engaging. The reference to Sinn Féin and the troubles in Northern Ireland, I think, is it's obscene, quite frankly, given how many lives and how many communities were ripped apart by the troubles. But actually, there's something else going on here. I think Ian Paisley used to work on the basis that his strategy was predict trouble, cause trouble, say I told you so. And that seems to be exactly what the unionists are doing in this. They are trying to stoke up quite a violent and aggressive division that I do not believe exists. Yes, there can be very strident disagreement. There can be very deeply held beliefs that are in opposition with the beliefs that Keith and I might have on independence. But we can disagree and be civil with each other. And I think one of the really, really important things for us as independent supporters is to remember that when we become independent, because we will, when we become independent, there are going to be people in Scotland who did not vote for independence, and we want them to be part of that new Scotland. So, it's really, really important to not only echo, but to strongly reinforce the point Keith made. We can't get drawn into this dystopian discussion around military analogies and that kind of thing. What we want to be doing is very, very clearly saying that we want a Scotland that is for everyone. And we know that not everybody will agree with the position on independence, but it's about making sure that we create a country where even people who disagree with us are welcome, even those who have very strong and firmly held belief on the union. They are welcome here. They are part of our communities. We're not going to drive them out. We're not going to march them out of the country. They are part of Scotland, and that's what is really, really important. So all of this discussion, I think, it is around trying to cause additional division and additional aggro around the debate. And I think we need to resist it at every opportunity. We need to keep our positions and our language positive. It's about a vision of a new country. For me, that's where we were in 2014. And that's what we need to be building again, and the fact that we've got a steady majority for independence in the polls recently is something, I think, down to that. We are saying, look, we can do politics differently. We can create a very different kind of political community in Scotland. It doesn't have to be that kind of militaristic, individualistic, very aggressive and confrontational style that we see coming from UK government and UK institutions.
Mm-hmm. And of course, in the 2014 referendum, virtually all, if not all, the violence that was reported during that campaign did come from the unionist side. Not blaming the parties or necessarily, but do you have concerns that this ramping up of the rhetoric is going to lead to more violence?
I think, in some ways that might be possible, but for me, what matters is that all of those, regardless of what side of the constitutional debate people are on, we know that words matter, language matters. And I think some unionists, definitely not all, and nowhere near the majority, but some unionists actually, I think, do want it to ramp up the violence, and that is what we've got to resist. We can see what's happened where this kind of Trumpian politics is in full swing on the other side of the Atlantic and elsewhere in Europe. We have to resist that. We've got to make it very, very clear that that's not the kind of politics we do. It's not the kind of politics that we engage in. because those aren't the kinds of communities we want. We don't want communities that are based on aggression. We don't want communities that are based on confrontation. We want our society to be able to deal with difference, deal with disagreement, but not have to deal with difference and disagreement in violent ways. It doesn't have to be like that. We can find alternative ways of living together, even if we disagree with each other. And I think that's really such an important point, because, you know, as I said, come independence, there are going to be people who stay in Scotland who didn't want Scotland to become independent, and I want them to stay. I want them to be part of our new country. I want them to continue to be part of the communities that they are currently a part of. And if we let the stoking up of hatred and aggression and violence happen, then we're doing damage to all of our futures, regardless of any outcome of any future referendum.
Mm-hmm. Now, we'll turn now to what's happening in the independence movement itself. And Maggie, as co-convener of the Scottish Independence Convention, I believe you were holding your AGM this week. So tell us a wee bit about what the convention has been up to.
Great. Well, we've had in some ways a busy year, despite not being able to do the kinds of things that we might have wished to be doing over the last 6 months because of the pandemic. I think there are two areas of work that I'd like to speak about. One is what we are calling a sort of getting the next referendum, or Scotland's right to choose. For us, very, very clearly about a nation, a people having the right to self-determination. And we know that politicians from across the political spectrum have signed up to that right for Scotland over the last few decades. And what we want to do with Scotland's right to choose is reassert that right and ensure that people actually understand what that means. The other aspect of work is around, once we get a referendum and we win that referendum, what are the stages, what are the things that need to take place to transition from the Scotland we have now to the Scotland being an independent country? And there's a whole host of work happening on transitions, on the kinds of activities that we need to have in place before a new and independent Scotland can begin. In the transitions work, we are looking at different clusters of policy and strategy. We have a cluster around all aspects to do with our social lives, health and well-being, social security, education, housing, homes, that kind of thing. We're looking at economic areas as well, so that's another cluster. So talking about currency, what are the options for currency? What are the options for different kinds of taxation systems? How do we create a banking system that is fit for a wealthy small nation, the state that we hope to be? And we're working on environmental work. You know, what are the kinds of things that we need to do to keep Scotland aligned with the highest possible environmental standards and regulations that we don't want to lose as a consequence of Brexit, for instance, but also how can we be world leaders in a carbon-free energy future, for instance? How can we protect our natural habitats across our country? And the other couple of clusters that we're working around traditional work, so the treaties that Scotland would want to be a part of, that we would need to work on signing up to, what we do about customs and borders, and of course the big thing is around foreign policy and defence. And finally, we're putting a lot of work in constitutional and legal matters. So how succession actually works. What are the processes and models that we want our new country to follow? How do we codify all of that? And what kind of legal changes, legal systems and legal processes do we need in place? So all of that work has been going on over the last few months, and we are going to start publishing the papers on this work over the coming weeks to allow people to have a read and start using them as a discussion. Because I think one thing that is very crucial in all of this is that nothing that happens for when Scotland is an independent country should be presented as a top-down thing. We are very, very keen to have a participative process in this. We want our new country to reflect the desire for a much more participatory democracy. We want our new country to reflect the importance that everybody's voice in our new country has a right to be heard. And I think we are trying to make sure then that the work we put out for discussion, we take on board people's ideas, we take on board suggestions and comments, and we give people the opportunity to start owning these ideas, to start owning the whether they are specific policies or whether they are strategic goals or objectives for our country. It has to be about bringing people into the debate. So that is one of the reasons why the sort of campaigning work that SIC has been doing through Voices for Scotland is so important. Voices for Scotland is not about talking to and focusing on those of us who are already convinced that independence is the right way forward. It's about reaching into those communities that maybe aren't so sure yet, reaching the people who might have voted no in 2014, might not have had a vote in 2014, or might have voted either way in 2014, but are now maybe swithering or unsure. So it's about reaching out and allowing discussions to take place where they matter, in communities, in people's workplaces, in people's own comfort zones, and using the material and the work that the transitions group are doing. We can give people a sort of food for discussion. We can give them ideas and suggestions for how those discussions might go, and hopefully we will hear back from them and be able to expand the work that we do, create different work streams, and maybe even, if we're lucky, be able to answer some of the questions that they have. But I think all of this work together is because, as a movement, we are seeking to bring people from across the independence movement together. It's not about any one group of people. It's not about any one group of individuals having all the answers. It's about sharing the effort, sharing the ideas, and sharing our creativity, because we know we are a creative people. We need to harness that creativity in the best way possible.
Mm-hmm. Now, Keith, the First Minister said back at the end of January on Brexit Day that there would be a series of papers being published by the Scottish Government in kind of setting out some of this stuff as well. What's happened to that?
I think by and large, the pandemic has happened obviously since that time. There's been work going on, certainly within the SNP. I've mentioned the social mission, which has had, for the SNP, what we call our National Assembly, which had over 300 people involved in it on the first day, and similar numbers on the second and third day. So there's substantial discussion going on about that. I think the Scottish Government's programme of activity has been largely overtaken by the pandemic and dealing with that, which I think they're doing a very good job on. But just to come back to Maggie's point, it's quite interesting from the stuff that Maggie said. We get a real flavour of the depth and the breadth of work that's going on within the independence movement, in this particular case, the Independent Convention. I was delighted to join the AGM last night, and we heard a fantastic presentation from Claire McGilvray on making rights matter, a very practical project that she'd been involved in, making housing rights matter for disadvantaged communities in Leith in Edinburgh. I think the reason why that's important is because sometimes you can look at Twitter and you can listen to some people saying nothing's happening. Well, a lot is happening, and it doesn't all happen on social media. So as well as the Scottish Independence Convention, I'm talking to yes groups on a regular basis. I think the next one is Grassroots Oban. people are coming up with proposals. The important point that Maggie made there, though, is the Independence Convention has Greens, SNP, Commonweal, various different groups involved in it. They tend not to spend their time shouting at each other saying, I'm more committed to independence than you are. They tend to come up with ideas about what they'd like to see in independent Scotland. And that has to be the way forward for the independence movement. I'm Deputy Leader of the SNP. I'm going to be promoting the SNP's proposals for independent Scotland. That doesn't mean to say that's got to be what happens, but we've got to have our position on this. But many others will do as well. And each person should have the right to try and paint their canvas of what an independent Scotland would look like. And that's why I think the convention has done some very important work. And going back to the previous point that Maggie made, I think it's really important to bear this in mind. Maggie is quite right to say, in relation to this warlike language that we've got, is a determined effort by the Unionists. If you remember what happened after 2014, they immediately wanted to paint it as a toxic and divisive referendum, which those of us involved in it right the way through knew it just wasn't. Maybe one bad egg on the yes side and lots of dubious activity happening elsewhere, but it was a very well conducted, civilised referendum which got international commendation for that. What you're seeing now is whether it's the Tory party in the shape of Douglas Ross and his unrelenting war, or Mr Blackett you talked about, almost in advance trying to paint the discussion in an independence referendum as being divisive. They're the ones that's making it divisive. So if we can continue to get the work done, whether it's through the Independence Convention, there will be more work coming out from the Scottish Government, I'm sure, and also from the very diverse other parts of the independence movement, there's a huge amount of work and thought going on in this just now. It's also true to say that we can't do some of the things that we want to do. I went on most of the marches, the under one marches. We can't do that just now for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. We can't do door-to-door activity, but we can talk to groups. I'm doing that on a regular basis, whether it's through Zoom. I know many Yes supporters are talking to people in their community. In fact, they're often seeing in local communities the most active people involved in things to help the community through this crisis are people involved with the Yes movement. So this is helping to drive up, I think, support for independence. And that is something that's very active. It's just as valuable if you convince one person that way than it is if you convince them door to door. And the last point I would want to make on this, whatever we're doing, whether it's producing papers, the discussions that we're having, some of the people that are now supporting independence were unionists in 2014. We have to make sure that they feel comfortable and that the others who I believe are willing to come across are not quite there yet, feel encouraged to do that. So I think having the very civilised, profound discussions that the Independence Convention has, which is mirrored in Yes groups around the country, and I think in the political parties, that contrast between what we're doing, constructive and positive, and what the unionists are doing in their unrelenting war couldn't be more marked, and only like to increase support for independence.
Mm-hmm. Now, another thing I just wanted to ask about, Keith, back in 2017, the SNP launched the ref.scot website, which raised almost £500,000 that was due to be ring-fenced for an independence campaign. Now, obviously, the SNP has had more elections to fight than it ever expected in the last few years, and it does seem that the finances of the party have been depleted somewhat. Is that money still sitting in a pot somewhere?
That money's, I'm not on the finance committee of the party. That money is available to be used for that purpose as far as I'm aware. But it is true to say, you're quite right to say that the SNP and other political parties will have taken a hit during the current pandemic. For example, annual conference that we have substantial funds for the party, and we're will take place for the SNP. That's very different, I would imagine, from previous conferences. It will be probably online, and the opportunities to raise funds through that are different. But the money that's been raised for independence will be used for independence. Indeed, we have had leaflets since I became Deputy Leader specifically about and only about independence, which are designed to try and be used by anybody supporting independence as well. And there's never, this idea that either Nicola Sturgeon or anybody in the SNP is less committed to independence because they've been in government or been in government for that long. I was in government for 10 years. Now, I thought it was an amazing privilege to be in government, and I think it's great the SNP are the government far rather than the Conservatives or Labour Party. But it doesn't mean to say they're urge for independence is diminished. When we joined the SNP, it's got two things on a membership card. One, to further the interest of the people of Scotland, which you can do by being involved in government and taking decisions, such as those that we've seen, which try to mitigate, say, for example, the bedroom tax. Positively, to create an investment bank, which I was lucky enough to do when I was in government. And the first thing is the sovereignty, self-determination, independence for Scotland. It's why I joined the SNP in 1984. I find that no less pressing. I'm no less frustrated than anybody else. I've been wanting to see this since 1984. So the SNP is committed to it. It will spend the resources that are required in order to make sure that we make that case come the referendum, which, as we've heard again, a referendum for the SNP will be in the manifesto for our election bid in 2021. So that is undiminished. The resources will be found to fight that campaign, and the SNP will be happy to lead that campaign and lead us through on to independence. I believe, more than I've ever done, that we stand on the brink of success for independence. And if you just keep that positive, constructive mindset, even though it's extremely frustrating, even though Brexit is happening, which I think has garnered more people towards the cause of independence, then I think we'll achieve independence very shortly.
I will come back to you in a moment on the election, but I'll turn to Maggie now for a second. Maggie, this the upcoming election, clearly there isn't going to be a referendum this year as we had hoped and expected. But the next kind of big challenge is the election for Holyrood next year. What do you think? How do you think the current context changes that election, where independence does appear to have a fairly stable majority support now? Do you think for example, the unionist parties can go into that election saying, "Vote for us to say no to a referendum," when the kind of implicit other side of that would be, if you don't vote for us, then you are going to get a referendum?
I mean, in some ways, I think we go into the elections, or political parties go into the Holyrood elections, setting out the stall that for the Scotland, for the kind of future Scotland that they want to see. So for the SNP, for the Greens, for other pro-Indy parties, it will be about doing what we can with the powers that Holyrood has at the moment and using those to further the cause of independence. What the unionists do, in some ways, I'm not sure I'm that interested in the kind of plan that they put forward, because they don't have a plan, I don't think. We hear quite often coming from unionist parties in Holyrood and elsewhere in the UK that it's all about just keeping the United Kingdom together because it's such a great entity. We know that there is so much more than that Scotland could do if it were given the powers to do that. And I think what we want to see, I think, in the wider independence movement, is using those powers now. We've seen a very clear difference in the responses of the respective governments to COVID. There may be some practical policy systems that have been very similar, but overall, from the UK government and from our First Minister, we've had very good, clear communication on a regular basis. The UK government has run away from clear, good communication on the COVID crisis. The Scottish government interest is clearly in the Scottish people. The UK government interest is clearly in giving government contracts to their pals. So, there's a very, very clear divergence of approach there. And I think it's those kinds of differences that is driving and sustaining that driving up and sustaining that increased support for independence. And I think what I want to see happen in the run up to the elections in May next year is for pro-independence parties to say, this is a very, very clear stage in our road to independence. It is maybe even one of the last steps we take in our road to independence. And therefore, it's about setting out the kind of positions that a future new country will have. And I think we can do across the independence movement, we can do quite a lot to support that by sharing the ideas. Yes, the parliamentary elections are inherently competitive. Political parties are there competing for seats. But that doesn't mean to say that any one party has the only possibility of presenting good ideas. There are going to be ideas that come from across the political spectrum that we can think about, we can discuss, we can debate in a constructive and grown-up political way, because in many ways I think Holyrood has shown itself to be able to do that, and use the best of those ideas that come out of the different political parties to create the best Scotland that we can possibly have after May next year, as the one of the last steps, I hope, towards an independent country.
And Keith, obviously, as a politician, you're not going to take any votes for granted. But with the way the polls sit just now, the SNP does look to be on track for a pretty significant win at the Holyrood election next year. What are the and you've said that the manifesto will have a clear commitment to a referendum, which we've heard would happen fairly soon afterwards. How quickly will that process be able to happen, and when do you expect a referendum to be possible?
But first of all, it won't just be the commitment to an independence referendum. I think that the SNP manifesto and the campaign that we have will have independence at its very heart. So, as Maggie says, showing what you can do with the powers of the Scottish Parliament, but also showing what kind of country we could be with independence will be central to the SNP's campaign. But that commitment to an independence referendum, if you think back to 1997, when Labour got in, they had a referendum within the space of a few months. Now, I can't predict, because I can't predict what the outcome of the election will be, how quickly it will happen, but there is no reason, especially given the work that's been carried out by Mike Russell and the Scottish Government on the referendums bill, that we can't proceed very quickly with that. But there is a political process to go through. But your really important point there is about the election and not taking things for granted. I know it's a cliche amongst party politicians, but for me, I remember back in 2011, I think at one point in March, that's about 2 months before the poll, Labour were about 15 points ahead of the SNP. And the SNP scored, as we all now know, a fantastic victory, 69 seats, and overcame the system that was designed to stop an independence majority. Now, you're right to say the polls look very good just now, but there's no way 8 months out we should take anything for granted. And Maggie, of course, will quite rightly argue for the Green vote, but I am determined to do what we can campaigning. And just to go back to a comment that's made in your chart bar, for campaigning for the elections next year, why can't we campaign for independence? I don't see the distinction. There's a limit on the campaign that we can do just now. There's a lot of work going in to see how we can ramp that up. And for example, we are having local by-elections looming very soon. We have to get campaigning for that as well. But I'm determined that we have, in my view, I want to see SNP votes 1 and 2, the strongest possible mandate for that referendum. Let's get that first, and then let's push on as quickly as possible thereafter to have the referendum. It's, people say, well, what happens if you don't get it? Well, that's a really important point. But if you look at the extent to which the unionist arguments are now so bizarre, this complete denial of democracy, it doesn't matter what mandate you have, doesn't matter the majority in the Scottish Parliament, you will never have a referendum, has been some of it. Now, we know that's unsustainable. Tories know that. Andy McKeever knows that, former Tory spin doctor. Peter Duncan knows that. John Curtis has said it's unsustainable. And for those that are sceptical that Boris Johnson might be a U-turn, just look at the last 5 months. Look at this week. The guy does nothing but U-turns. So I am confident this will be the route through which we get independence, but we only get it if we get that majority, that mandate through the Scottish parliamentary elections next year. So that's what I'm focused on. And at its heart will be that commitment to have the referendum as soon as practically possible after the election.
And Maggie, then, obviously you're no longer co-convener of the Green Party, but do you expect the Greens to have a similarly strong commitment to independence in their manifesto?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, Greens see independence as the way to get the kind of country we want, the kind of country that can be a world leader in peacemaking around the world, a country that can be a world leader in carbon neutral energy systems, in renewable energy systems, and using what we've been talking about for some time now within the Greens as a Green New Deal, a truly just transition that not only moves us away from an economy that's based on dirty fuel, but creates a clean economy that also supports well-being, that also supports decent jobs for people, all of those things. But I think actually, we talking about we talk about what's important for pro-independence parties in the Holyrood elections next May, and I think that commitment to an independent Scotland is up there for all of us. There isn't any debate there, and I think what there needs to be very, very clear communication between and across the pro-independence parties that will have seats in the Scottish Parliament after May's election, is how we work together, because we know that we aren't going to be able to defeat some of the forces that are playing very, very powerfully against us unless we pull together. And to me, that's one very, very important thing, that the strength of the Scottish Parliament is its diversity and its plurality of voices for independence, because that allows us as a wider movement to turn around and say to the UK government, you do not speak for us. You do not have the capacity to answer the questions that we have, to be able to put a prospectus forward for the kind of country that we want. Only those of us in Scotland can do that for Scotland. And I think that to me is a very, very powerful point. I think you talked with Keith a little bit also about, how we get to the point of having another independence referendum. I think for me and for Democrats across the independence movement, it's about the right to self-determination. And we know that there are more people in Scotland who support that right than support independence. And that's really, really important to hold on to. We know that Labour and the Liberal Democrats signed the Claim of Right. They understand the democratic the vital democratic role that people deciding their own future has in democracy. And I think we need to hold on to that. We need to remind our colleagues, some of our unionist colleagues in Labour and the Lib Dems, that they signed that and they still believe that. And we need to work with them on that as well, because this is fundamentally about Scotland's right to choose. It's everybody's right in Scotland to have a voice in that debate.
Well, that is just probably a very good place to end. I notice we're very, very short of time. This hour has flown by. So I would like to thank Maggie Chapman and Keith Brown very much for joining us. It's been a very interesting discussion. A lot of you tweeting in with a lot of interesting thoughts as well. We didn't have time to answer everybody's questions. I hope that both of you will be willing to come back again sometime and we can talk about all this further. But that is all we have time for tonight. So thank you again. Thank you to you at home for joining us as well. This is what we do these shows for, is to have an audience, for you to get involved, to let you hear from these politicians in a way that you might not hear on other channels, particularly not if they're being interviewed by someone like Andrew Neil. If you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland to let us keep doing this kind of work, then please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register, sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month will make a huge difference to what we're able to do here at Broadcasting Scotland. If you aren't able to support us financially, that's not a problem. We do understand the shows will always be free to view online, but you can still help us out in a big way by following us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, finding us on Facebook, finding our YouTube channel, just search for Broadcasting Scotland, subscribe to the channel there, like the videos, share the videos around, let people know where we are, what we do, and why you enjoy it, you can be the marketing team for us. That's a really important job for you to do if you want to help Broadcasting Scotland succeed. And finally, if you want to get involved here at Broadcasting Scotland, it does take a lot of work to build a TV station. So if you're interested in any way in getting involved, this is a great way to help build a better Scotland. So do please let us know if you're interested. There's lots of opportunities here for you. But that is absolutely all we have time for. So thank you once again to Maggie and to Keith. I'll be back on Sunday with the full Scottish, and then Gordon will be back on Monday with another Scotland at 7. But until then, thanks again for joining us and have a great weekend. Good night.